Yes. Give it a second. All right. So welcome, everyone. I'm Eileen Everett, the Executive Director of the Environmental Education Association of New Mexico. And today we're going to be exploring the New Mexico STEM Ready standards and what they mean for the environmental education community. Before we jump into our meeting today, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that we've had some interesting turn of events over the last 24 hours. And I do want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the people in Las Vegas, all of the lives that were lost yesterday, all of those who have been injured, and all of the families and friends of all of those who have been impacted as well. So before we jump in and talk about the New Mexico STEM Ready standards and what they mean for our environmental education community, I'd like to talk briefly about what environmental education is and who we are as an organization. So in its simplest form, environmental education is understanding that in every moment we are impacting our environment. And in every second of our lives, we're being influenced by our environment as well. It's multidisciplinary. It can be done through art, science, math, history, at all ages. The Environmental Education Association of New Mexico is an affiliate of the North American Association for Environmental Education. And you can see our vision statement here. As an organization, we really are viewing the story right now in New Mexico as how do we really think about systems change and systems thinking. So in New Mexico right now, there are no systems or requirements in place for our 300,000 K through 12 students to learn outside. They don't exist right now. Today, we're viewing this as an opportunity to really think about what's being proposed by the New Mexico Public Education Department in terms of the New Mexico STEM Ready standards as an opportunity to shift that. How can we think about opportunities that exist in what's being proposed with the standards to encourage our K through 12 students to learn outdoors? A couple of things I want to mention for our organization. Upcoming in just over a month, we have our two-day statewide environmental literacy summit. Our primary audience for this event is non-formal educators from around the state. This year we are making history with the Sandia Mountain Natural History Center, who is celebrating its 50th anniversary. We're going to be also hosting the summit as our first all-outdoor summit, so I hope to see some of you there as well. I do need to mention that as a small nonprofit, taking on an effort like this is really something that's a big task for us. If you're not currently an EEANM member, I definitely encourage you to join today. If you've let your membership lapse, it's a great time to renew. You can visit our website at any time. It just takes a few minutes to sign up and join on our secure website. Again, as a small nonprofit, we're really trying to take steps to listen to our environmental education community and engage you in the ways that you want to be engaged. So today's meeting, the other meetings that are happening this week, is in response to what we've heard from all of you. You want more information about what's being proposed, you want to share your ideas, we're here to listen and we're responding to that. I'd also like to thank our other community partners that are hosting meetings. We're really fortunate that we have some really valued organizational members, one in northern New Mexico, the Pajarito Environmental Education Center, and one in southern New Mexico, the Asombro Institute for Science Education, who are generously hosting other community meetings in other parts of the state this week. So tomorrow in Las Cruces, the Asombro Institute for Science Education will be hosting a meeting at their location. On Wednesday, October 4th, at the Los Alamos Nature Center, the Pajarito Environmental Education Center will be hosting as well. Both of these organizations have already taken steps to implement next generation science standards in their programs, and I encourage all of you to take a few moments, if you don't already know about the great work of these organizations, to visit their websites as well. I do want to mention for any type of community meeting, any type of gathering, to lay some groundwork for some expectations for us spending our time together today. Please make sure your cell phones are off. I just checked mine a few moments ago. We're going to be exploring lots of new things today. Please be open to new ideas. Seek first to understand before being understood. Listen to all people respectfully and respond thoughtfully. There might be places that we disagree with one another today. That's okay. That's how we learn from one another. Selena and I will be working on presentations, and I'll introduce Selena in a moment, so please give us space to share some information. We've built time in for a question and answer session, so we'll make sure to answer any questions that you have. And if something doesn't make sense, feel free to ask for clarification. We want to make sure that you understand what the information we're sharing, and that we're providing it in the best way that we can. The purpose of this meeting is twofold. The first purpose is, how can we provide you information on what's being proposed? The New Mexico STEM Ready standards, as EEANM views them, are really next generation science standards with revisions. So what are next generation science standards? What's being proposed? What is the process by which the public education department adopts these standards? And what are the ways that we can comment, either as an individual or as a representative of a group, an organization, or an agency? We're also going to use this meeting, and we've also opened this up online at EEANM.org to be able to get input from our community as well. So we'll be sharing ways that you can do that as well. I also want to be clear about what this meeting is and what this meeting is not. So what this meeting is today is an opportunity to learn about next generation science standards. It's a place to understand what the public education department is proposing. It's a way for you to share your ideas and perspectives with us so that we as an organization can provide the most meaningful comments that we can to the public education department. This is also an opportunity to learn ways that you can comment and you can provide feedback either as an individual or a representative of your own organization or agency. I want to be clear about what this meeting is not. This meeting is not a place to debate human-caused climate change, evolution, or other sound science. As an organization, we stand behind that science is science. We root our work in science. This is also not a place to get consensus from the whole environmental education community. There are hundreds of us from around the state. We simply don't have the capacity or the time to have full conversation that would probably take us months or years to come to a place of consensus. We're going to do our best to listen to as many different voices as we can in this process. Given that this is an all-volunteer effort, we do not have the capacity to use all lenses that we might bring into the room today. We are going to rather focus on using the lens of environmental education today. We will not be collecting comments to give to the public education department, but we will give you plenty of information of how you can provide those comments yourself. And lastly, we are an apolitical organization that is rooting this conversation in science. Before I hand things over to Selena, I do just want to mention that EEANM's Board of Directors last October did vote unanimously to approve the following statement that you can see about our stance as an organization about next generation science standards, that we fully support next generation science standards as written. What's been proposed is next generation science standards with revisions, so we are going to be exploring today how we can provide comments about the revisions that have been suggested. So it is my pleasure to hand things over to Selena Keneally, who is one of our valued Environmental Education Association New Mexico members. She's also one of our local experts on next generation science standards. And back in 2015, worked with EEANM to offer a variety of workshops on next gen science standards focused on supporting the informal science community. So Selena, thank you very much for taking the time. Really appreciate it. And let me switch over your presentation and come on up.
So I want to thank Eileen and Colleen and the rest of the board that's represented here for the opportunity to talk about this. I don't know if you guys have heard, but there's this thing about science standards, and there's a lot of people who do this. I was shocked, actually, to see how much there is in the media, how much I'm hearing from people who don't have any idea what's going on. So my goal today is not to give you my opinion of what we need to do or how you should think. I'm going to try to give you based in what I know are the facts, and let you make some decisions about what you think is important for your personal position or for any organizations that you have. I asked Eileen to introduce me as the an Environmental Education of New Mexico member. And that's how I'm representing myself today. But I wanted to give you guys a little background on sort of where I come from, because I think it's important for me to say that. I'm not here representing my job or my organization. I'm here as a member, but certainly what I do has some bearing. So in my day job, I get paid to work for New Mexico EPSCOR, which is an NSF-funded project based out of UNM, but it actually serves the entire state around the capacity to do science research in our state. Also a member of the New Mexico Science Teachers Association. I am a past member of the Math and Science Advisory Council, so that is providing advice to the Public Education Department and to the Secretary. Kim serves on that board currently. And then I've been involved in standards in the state actually from the early 2000s, when the last time New Mexico decided to think about science standards. Those were adopted in 2003, updated a little in 2006, and then they stand today pretty much as they were adopted in 2003. So here's my plan for what we're going to do today. I'm going to do a quick 101 on NGSS. What is it? Where did it come from? What are the major components? And a little bit of a timeline related to that. Then I'm going to talk to you about how does New Mexico adopt standards? And I know there's a lot of questions about what's the role of the legislature, and what's the role of the governor, and what's the role of the PED and all of this. And I'm going to tell you in terms of the statute and the procedures that we have, what that looks like. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about the New Mexico STEM-ready standards and how they've been proposed, and what I know about how they are different and how they are same from the next generation science standards. After that, we'll have time for a few questions, but then Eileen has outlined a process to really try to get people to engage in those proposed standards and think for yourself, as well as provide advice to EEANM about what we might want our organization to say about that going forward. So, 2012, this book was published. It's a narrative book. You can read it cover to cover, which actually I have, because as a grad student, this was assigned for me for class. I can't imagine many people have read this cover to cover, but this came out of the National Research Council, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization out of Washington, D.C., and funded with money from Carnegie, somebody else, and I'm forgetting who the other is. Private money, put this together. So what does this get us, this framework? First thing is it tells us the goals for science education. And I think it's really important that you see both of these goals. First, that science education in the United States should educate all students in science and engineering. Engineering is a new piece for us science teachers, but 2012 got published. And then number two, providing the foundational knowledge for those who will become the scientists, engineers, technologists, and technicians of the future. So the future STEM people, this is foundational information for them. It's educating all our students so that they are scientifically literate citizens, and educating the future workforce in STEM. Something else that the framework gets you are these 3 dimensions. You've probably heard the 3 dimensions: practices, core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts. That comes out of the framework. It's not part of the standards. It's actually the framework that was developed beforehand. Notice the colors, and notice the organization of this. Lots of times when we think about things on a written page, we'll often have things hierarchical, because whatever's at the top feels like it's the most important, versus this, and then the stuff that's down, well, all right, I don't need to pay as close attention to that. This is very intentional, that all 3 of these things had equal weight. Practices, the doing of the science, the core ideas. This is what most people think are the standards, those disciplinary core ideas. What do scientists know about how our world works? And then cross-cutting concepts, which is actually the most exciting part for me, but the idea that something like energy and matter is a concept that can be carried across all science disciplines, and in fact, can be carried across many disciplines in ways for us to understand the world. So I'm going to show you just briefly what these look like. Here are the scientific and engineering practices. When you see parentheses, that's where they're calling out that science practices are different from engineering practices. So you'll see that in number 1 and number 6. Our current standards, as well as national standards that came before, talked about this thing called inquiry. And it turns out we all sort of go, oh yeah, we do inquiry, but it's actually really hard to define if you just call it inquiry. The practices are a way to actually call out all those things that we want our students to be able to do in the practice of science, not just in the knowing of science. So here's my favorite, the cross-cutting concepts. I've been working with Deb over the past 5 years doing energy teacher professional development, and the cool concept that energy is energy in life science and in physical science and in earth and space science. That's, I think, pretty eye-opening for me as a leader, but also for our teachers to imagine that we could actually teach these concepts that it builds for kids over the course of years, over the course of the different classes that they're taking. And then this is too small for anybody to read, but I wanted to throw these up here. Here are the disciplinary core ideas as outlined by the framework, and then you'll find them again in the standards. So it's broken up into the three that we are familiar with from our New Mexico standards, so physical science, life science, earth and space science, and then this other piece is engineering, technology, and application of science. In the lower grades, that ETAS is actually embedded in most of the standards, but at the upper grades, you'll see those called out a bit more. So in New Mexico, we were starting to have conversations in 2013 about, oh, what are these new standards? What does this mean for our state? We certainly were not at the table. We were not at the table as a state, because there are 26 states who participated in 2013 in the publication of the Next Generation Science Standards. So that's the standards and the appendix. It makes me nervous when the appendix needs to be its own book, but okay. So, notice those three colors are still there. And you'll also notice that they have this new tagline, for states, by states. Think about what's happening in 2013. This is smack dab in the middle of Common Core adoption. And everybody was saying, oh my gosh, what is the federal government coming and doing to our state? And although Common Core wasn't the federal government, it was a national effort. So the folks who were working on the Next Generation Science Standards said, how can we make this better so it doesn't feel like it's this big national federal effort? So they invited states to come and participate as lead states. There are 26 states that were part of that, to help develop these standards, to be part of the writing teams, to bring things back to their state, to get feedback from their community. But even though we in New Mexico weren't one of those 26 states, we were able to provide comment to these standards. And in fact, more than 10,000 people from across the US provided comment about the Next Generation Science Standards. They were issued in draft form in the early part of the year, and then sometime, I don't know, by spring, they were made finalized. And I hosted a session here. There were others who hosted sessions to provide feedback about that. So what do these standards get us? I picked the 5th grade standards because I'm familiar with our current standards. Matter and energy, organisms, and ecosystems. This is what the standards look like if you pick up this book or you go to the nextgenscience.org website. If we're talking about the standards, we're actually really talking about these performance expectations for students, 1, 2, 3. And each of those is built on these 3 pillars. Remember those 3 woven things, the cross-cutting concepts, disciplinary core ideas, and the science and engineering practices. This probably looks pretty familiar to those of us who are teaching 5th graders. Let's see. Support an argument that plants get the materials they need for growth chiefly from air and water. Develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. This is energy diagram. This is food webs. This is this kind of thing. So where is NGSS in terms of adoption? There are 18 states in the US that have adopted NGSS entirely in its form as published, and you'll see where they are right there. Interestingly, Kansas was number 1. We would not expect Kansas to be jumping to be number 1, but they were, and they really, through the efforts of one particular person who was involved in the writing of it, was able to get their State Board of Education, because that's how they adopt standards, to be comfortable with the idea once they came out. They still stand in Kansas, so that's excellent. There are a number of other states who haven't adopted NGSS directly for various reasons. Some of them have adopted NGSS mostly, put a new name on them to make it sound like it's the Michigan standards. I forget what those are actually called. But so places like Michigan, Louisiana, Wyoming, Arkansas, and then Idaho is actually in the process of doing this, where it is mostly NGSS, and there are some tweaks at the state level. Finding the information about who has done that is really tricky. So the people who do NGSS are really proud of this part, so it's everywhere. But the people who take and change their standards, they don't want to be associated with NGSS. Part of why they changed the name is they don't want it to say NGSS. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure other people do, but I wasn't able to find that.
How many did you say mostly adopted it?
Everybody, absolutely adopted is 18. Mostly I don't know. So I know of like 6 or 8, but I don't know. And they're in various different kind of stages. So I can tell you, for example, Texas will never adopt, because Texas does their own, I mean, we know this, Texas just doesn't get along with anybody. They'll never adopt NGSS. They're in the never pile. But almost everybody else, I think, is in a maybe or somehow be incorporated. So here's the timeline of what's happened here in New Mexico. So 1997, this book was published, National Science Education Standards. Relatively similar group of people who pulled together the framework. New Mexico took a few years before we were ready to adopt our own science standards. And I was on the middle school writing team for this. And I have to say, we all went into this with these plans. It was going to be Mexican, it was going to be different. And it's really pretty much this with some New Mexico stuff in it. So we have, our science standards are very much built on this. And if this is supported in 1997, you can imagine that this is probably thinking and ideas that are at least 10 years old. So we're talking when I was in high school, probably, the ideas about this. So 2010 is when we adopted Common Core, and I didn't realize this because I only paid attention to Common Core math, STEM person that I am. But when we adopted Common Core, we actually added about 15% unique material for New Mexico in the ELA part. So I'll have to go in and take a look to see what that looks like. So we already talked about the framework getting published and then NGSS being published. In 2015, the PED, through the Math and Science Bureau, actually convened teacher focus groups. And that made, to me, that feels like, oh, okay, this number of people, it was about 100 teachers from around the state that came together twice over the course of the spring to learn about NGSS, really dig into it, try to understand what are the shifts, how is this different, my questions, what does it mean for curriculum and assessment and all that kind of stuff. And then that group came back together to really compare NGSS to our science standards. I helped with the group that was doing the grade 3 through 5 science standards. And then finally that group actually published a letter, which I have a copy of, that said, yep, our state needs to adopt these science standards as they're written. So, let's see. So this past session, there was a bill introduced in the legislature by Bill McCamley and Andres Romero, who's a social studies teacher, I think, in the South Valley. Maybe I can come up with a school. Atrisco Heritage. And they introduced a bill, which actually had been introduced a couple of times before, but this time in 2017, it got a lot of traction. And so I ended up at the legislature and I testified in front of 3 different committees about this. And the legislators were a little confused, and some of them said, wait a second, this isn't a legislative matter. This is an administrative code matter. And I'm like, well, I can't speak to that because I don't have expertise here, but boy, New Mexico really needs NGSS. My advocacy hat's coming on here. It passed out of the House with, I think, 1 Republican vote, and all the Democrats. Passed out of the Senate, I think, clearly on party lines. Got to the governor, it was vetoed. And it did not get, it got vetoed with the appropriate message. So it was truly dead. It wasn't coming back. And that time expired before anybody thought to bring it back up, because of course our legislature could override that veto if they so chose. So fast forward to just a few weeks ago when the PED proposed the New Mexico STEM Ready standards. And you can see that they've already done something that what you've seen from lots of other states. We're going to change the name. And I think that that has 2 purposes. One is it signals to people who are interested in local control or states' rights, well, this is a New Mexico thing. And it also signals, hey, we're different in New Mexico. We've really thought about this. This is how we want to make it different. I'm not going to comment on whether I think those are good ideas or not good ideas, but I do think that that was what was behind the idea. So let me go a little bit into where do our standards sit in our state. And I said, the legislative process isn't appropriate. So let me tell you where they are.
And if you're going to touch on this later, please pardon me. But who is on the group that came up with the next steps?
Okay. So I know the answer to that, but it's not public knowledge. It's the public education department, their staff, the Math and Science Bureau, and the people who handle standards are the ones that came up with that language that's there. So I don't think it's useful to talk about the specific person, but it was not an outside group that came in and said, we need you to do this. So the standards sit in the administrative code, and I apologize if people know this, but I really didn't know this until I started getting into testifying in front of this legislative committees. So the legislature is in charge of passing laws, those are statutes, and then to carry out the laws, those departments that report to the governor are the ones that write basically the regulations, and that's what the administrative code is. So if you see on here, I just did a screenshot of our current standards, and if you see where it says statutory authority, that's the laws that the legislature passed, which basically says they grant the authority and responsibility for the assessment and evaluation of public schools, blah, 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 to the PED. And then they direct the department to set graduation expectations and hold schools accountable. They require the department to adopt academic content and performance standards and to measure the performance of public schools in New Mexico. That's the law. That's what the law says. So you can imagine that law doesn't actually give you very much information. So the PED is in charge of figuring out, okay, well, what does that mean? And our current standards sit in the New Mexico Administrative Code. You can find it. There's a website where that exists. And I'm actually not sure what the June 30, 2009 refers to, because there weren't standards changes. There must have been some change in statute that required some amount of change to the administrative code. So another piece that's important to know about is, I know, isn't this an awesome document? So I thought, let me see if there's an org chart for New Mexico state government. Well, here it is. And so the Math and Science Bureau is somewhere, or the PED is somewhere over here, and Math and Science Bureau is in there, and Math and Science Advisory Council has a little, you're on there. So that, you made the org chart. So at the top, it's the three branches. You guys know this from civics class, right? So in the middle is executive, over here is legislative, and then on this far side is judicial, which I don't know anything about, so we just won't go there. We've touched a little bit on the legislative piece of it, but I thought it would be helpful for me to give you guys a maybe blown up version of that that's completely incomplete. But in New Mexico, our executive is headed by the governor, of course, who is elected every 4 years. She's term limited, so she'll have one more year. And then there are a number of agencies that are sort of considered cabinet level agencies. There's quite a few more than fit on here, but I needed to fill in the bottom there. So places like the Public Education Department, Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, Children, Youth, and Families Department, Higher Ed Department, and Department of Cultural Affairs. It used to be that PED and HED were one department, and thanks to Richardson and some deals that they cut, they split those into 2 departments. So it's important for us to know this as you're thinking about standards, because the executive is the one that gets to set the standards. We decided that. So when that PED-HED split happened, there's also a State Board of Education. And the State Board of Education used to have the authority to appoint the cabinet secretary, but not anymore. So if you look at the org chart, there's a State Board of Education that's out by itself. And as far as I know, they're only in charge of granting charters. They really have almost no power. Back when the standards were adopted the last time, it was the State Board that made that decision. And they're made up of elected officials. And in fact, they still are. You could run for State Board. Now, why anybody would want to do that, because it's sort of irrelevant, I don't know, but it's interesting. Okay. So here's how we adopt standards in New Mexico, or how we're supposed to adopt standards in New Mexico. I don't know what would have happened if that statute had passed. Statutes take precedence over the code, so it would have, something would have had to happen, but it would, I don't know. Somebody smarter than me would have known that. So here's what has to happen according to how our state is organized. PED publishes the notice of proposed changes to the code, which they've done. There has to be a 30-day public comment period, which we're right in the middle of. There has to be a public hearing. Now, the public hearing could just be a half hour someplace that's not very convenient to people, but in fact, I think it's a 3-hour in Santa Fe. Still not very convenient to people, but it's longer than the half hour that they'd have to do. And then the secretary makes the decision. So it's important for us to be cognizant of what kind of power we have as citizens and what kind of power we don't have. The secretary, apparently there's new legislation that requires them to actually look at all of the comment and say that they've read it. So I'm pleased to see that. That doesn't say they have to look at the comment and say that they've read it and do something about it. I like his expression. So here's the New Mexico STEM Ready Standards. I'm already irritated that in some places it has a hyphen, in some places it doesn't have a hyphen. But okay, that's all right. This is what's published that was put out at the beginning of that 30-day period. One thing I want you to notice is the effective date is July 1, 2018. So it wouldn't be effective immediately, even after a decision. It would go into effect next fiscal year. All this language at the top is pretty much the same. And then when you get to 629.10.6 is when things start to look a little bit different. So I'm trying really hard not to give you my opinions. I'm going to try to give you the facts about what I know to be true. So how do standards impact teaching and learning? Because as a science educator, that's what I care about. Of course, I care about the purity of science and that science is real and that it doesn't matter if you're in New Mexico or you're in Bangladesh or you're whatever. I care about all of those too. But what's really important to me is what does this mean for teaching and learning in our state? And so I want to sort of offer some ideas about what I think what it means. The standards set a minimum standard for what all students know and are able to do. There are things like AP courses, IB courses that go above and beyond our standards. And those are governed by those governing bodies. New Mexico we are an AP state, not going away. Doesn't matter what standards we adopt, we'll continue to do that. I do know that next year is materials adoption in the state budget. So every 7 years, a subject is supposed to come up so that districts get to set aside a specific kind of amount of money that they can spend to buy curriculum materials. Last year in the session, they changed the date because it was actually supposed to be adopted this year. And that would have been a tragedy for us to adopt based on our standards that are however many years old. But they only pushed it out to next year. So I think there's some interesting opportunities there. Standards are used to put together the course descriptions. It's called the STARS code that the PED uses to help designate specific courses. If a school district wants to stand up a new course, they actually have to go through an approval process through the PED to do that and develop basically a STARS description. So it's what you would see in a course catalog. But then backing that up actually is saying, and these specific standards are going to be covered in this course. Standards don't direct implementation or teacher training. So thinking about our standards now, and that doesn't actually give our state any guidance into how we should train teachers or how it should be implemented. It really is just a standards. It just says what we want students to know and be able to do. I know this to be true, that teachers make a lot of decisions in their classrooms. Standards in and of themselves aren't going to change those decisions. They're really just words. And then, so that's kind of at the individual teacher level. It also doesn't direct classroom-based instruction or curriculum. One of the things that was really disappointing for me to see these new standards is like, well, this is stupid stuff for kids to do. Why would I want kids to do this modeling, blah, 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 blah? That's really only what kids should be able to do. It's not about curriculum. It's just saying at the end of having done all of these rich and wonderful things, students should be able to do this. And truth be told, we should be able to assess them on that. And so that's another piece where I think standards really at the state level have a huge impact on what happens. And that is through the standards-based assessment, which right now we test kids at 4th, 7th, and 11th. So it's one at each elementary, middle, and high school. And then in high school, there are these end of course exams that are supposed to be shared across the state. So if you're teaching Algebra 2, you give the Algebra 2 end of course exam, so you have a sense of being able to compare how do kids in Farmington do on Algebra 2 versus how do kids in Raton do on Algebra 2. So let me just talk briefly through an analysis I did about the standards. Those got published. They were just these words on page. And I'm like, well, it looks like NGSS. It's really hard to tell what's not NGSS. It certainly has NGSS language, the conventions, the way things are named, all of those things. So I went through and I did a line-by-line comparison. I looked at each standard. What did it say in NGSS? What does it say in New Mexico STEM Ready standards? So for an elementary school, they are proposing a total of 107 standards. 89 of them are NGSS, straight up, no changes. One of them has changed, and I will have an opportunity to take a closer look at that. And they've added these 17 sort of New Mexico flavor standards. Let me show you what this looks like at middle school. There's a total of 80 standards. 66 of them are NGSS, straight up. 4 of them are changed, which includes 3 changes and 1 that was actually completely omitted. And they've added 10 New Mexico flavor standards. And then in high school, there's a total of 69. 56 of them are NGSS. 5 are revised, NGSS with some changes, and then there are 8 New Mexico flavor. Let me show you an example of some of these things. So here at 5th, we're staying at 5th grade. This is something that was added into the standards. Use information to discover STEM careers throughout the state and know that both men and women of all races and social backgrounds have these careers. Something that was in our next STEM Ready standards that don't show up in NGSS. One, you can tell because it says throughout the state. It's very obvious this has state implications. So what somebody might, there's a couple of things that you might observe about this. This is New Mexico Science and Society, which is actually a whole new group that PED is proposing. Some people might be uncomfortable with that gender binary of men and women. There is sort of also a value judgment about whether it is true that men and women of all races and social backgrounds have STEM careers. I don't have much to, I don't know the answer to that. So one of the challenges with these New Mexico STEM Ready, these New Mexico flavor ones, is that they probably are the brainchild of 1 or 2 people. They have not had the opportunity to be crowdsourced by 10,000 people like NGSS was. Here's one that's at middle school that has been eliminated. Analyze displays of pictorial data to compare patterns of similarities in embryological development across multiple species to identify relationships not evident in the fully formed anatomy. Any ideas on why this might be taken out? What do you think? Why would somebody worry about that? Stem cell research, maybe abortion. It feels like a word that's really scary, and the easiest way to deal with it, we're gonna erase it. We're gonna get rid of it. I think my sense is that this is actually just a science science literacy issue. People think, oh, this is about stem cells. We can't have this. This would be too political. So we'll just get rid of it. This is actually the only one that's completely gotten rid of, which is interesting, I think. And then here are 2 out of high school. One that's based in earth science and one that's based in evolution and life science. So the way to read this is where it's crossed out is it's in NGSS but not in STEM Ready, and then where it's underlined is where it's been added back in, where it's been added in but isn't from NGSS. I think it's rather ridiculous that we might be okay with global climate change, but we're not going to talk about regional climate change. As if New Mexico's this place that's not part of the globe, so just the way it's punctuated, it doesn't quite work the way that is. And then the second one, evolution is still pretty strong in the standard, but it's actually changing out simultaneous coevolution. So I think that takes me to the end of the things I wanted to make sure I shared with you all. Are there questions before we move on to the next round? Practicing my wake time.
There are also an opportunity to ask more questions.
It was so straightforward that I didn't generate any questions. Or I lulled everybody to sleep.
No, that was really good. There's a lot to get through, and Selena, we really appreciate you leading us through that. So bear with me 1 second. Let me switch back over to our other presentation. Okay, so now that we've learned what is being proposed and the process and some of the next steps, I think, of what will happen with the Public Education Department, what can we actually do with this information? So let me skip to our next steps. So this week, the week of October 2nd, today and through Thursday, we're going to be collecting your ideas and listening to your feedback and your perspective on how we can provide thoughtful comments in response, in preparing our response to the Public Education Department. What we will begin doing on Friday and then move through the weekend into early next week is we are going to be drafting a letter that will be reviewed by the Environmental Education Association of New Mexico's Board of Directors next week. We will be releasing the draft letter early in the week. We're hoping on Monday, October 29th. We're going to be releasing it in a form that anyone will be able to pull out whatever language you feel comfortable with, that you want to edit and use for your own responses, again, as an individual or representative group or an agency. So we're going to be as transparent as we can be with compiling the feedback that we received this week, sharing all of those ideas with all of you, as well as providing a draft letter that you can feel free to pull language out and use yourself in whatever way feels comfortable to you, while our board of directors is reviewing that draft to get it to a place that they feel comfortable with to submit that to the Public Education Department. How you can comment, we're going to be doing a session here in a few minutes together. You can feel free to visit our website. We do have a Google Doc available on our website right now. And you can see we do have this urgent update, next generation science standards. It's right on our homepage at EEANM.org. It's the first thing that comes up as you scroll down. You can click, as you go through the urgent update, you'll see that there is a link now to this Google Doc. If you click on the Google Doc, it will bring you to a page that will give you directions on how you can comment. And we made this accessible so that anybody can provide comments. If you have a Gmail account, that's great, but you don't need a Gmail account to be able to click on this and provide your comments. If you'd like to provide a comment, please highlight whatever you'd like to provide a comment about on this Google Doc. And this little circle is going to pop up that says add a comment. You can click in here, and a new box will pop up that will allow you to actually type in a comment, click comment. We'll be able to see your feedback down on that Google Doc. You'll be able to see what everybody else is saying as well. We're going to take the comments that we hear from you tonight. We're going to upload those as well to the Google Doc so that we can take the feedback that we receive. And same thing will be going on in Las Cruces and Los Alamos in the next couple of days. Again, we're going to compile all of the ideas that we hear. We're going to share that with everyone along with our draft letter a week from today so that people can provide their own comments. So I encourage you on our website, again, at EEANM.org, under the urgent update on next generation science standards, we had this information posted. We have information about the public hearing that's happening on Monday, October 16th. If you can join us in Santa Fe from 9 to noon, that's great. We also have information on how you can provide comments either through the mail, through email, or through fax. So all that information is available up on our website, so you'll be able to comment yourself. I'd like all of us as a community to use this as an opportunity to think about. I mentioned before that, again, there are no systems requirements in place for our 300,000 K through 12 students to learn outside. Those of us in the environmental education community, we talk all of the time about what we witness, what we see with our students learning outside. Better attention spans, increased test scores, lower drug use, more engaged community members and citizens. Let's use this as an opportunity to think about how can we shift those systems? How can we provide recommendations hear for New Mexico that how can we take advantage of these beautiful spaces that exist all around us and encourage our students to learn outside. So you'll see that we have suggested revisions for each grade level. We're starting to work on that language. We want your feedback and we want your help. We have some ideas at the elementary and middle school level. We really need some help at the high school level. So please take some time, take a look at our website. We'll jump into it here. And I thank everybody for taking the time to be part of this conversation. And I'm going to stop the recording. Hopefully, maybe.